Being alone, it can be a time to recharge, to find peace. But sometimes, being alone is when the nightmares begin. In today's video, we're diving into 3 terrifying true stories that happened to people when they were completely alone. From a stranger lurking outside a cabin to a sinister landlord who wasn't what he seemed, these tales will make you think twice about being isolated. These stories are chilling, disturbing, and all too real. By the end, you'll see just how quickly isolation can turn into something dangerous, and how these individuals barely made it out. So, if you're ready to step into the dark side of being alone, let's begin with our first story. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend escape. The protagonist had been feeling burned out from work and thought a remote Airbnb in the middle of the woods would be the perfect solution. The photos online had shown a cozy, rustic cabin surrounded by nothing but trees for miles. It seemed idyllic, no noise, no distractions, just pure tranquility. They arrived late in the afternoon, greeted by the crisp air and the dense stillness of the forest. The cabin itself was charming, exactly as advertised, a small living room with a fireplace, a snug kitchen, and a single bedroom. After unpacking, they settled in for the evening, ready to embrace the solitude. As dusk turned to night, the cabin's isolation began to feel more apparent. Every creak of the wooden floorboards seemed louder, every rustle of the wind outside felt closer. But it wasn't until they stepped onto the deck to admire the stars that they noticed it: movement in the woods. Just a shadow, barely visible among the trees, but unmistakably human. A figure walking slowly, deliberately. The protagonist froze, squinting into the darkness, but the figure soon disappeared into the dense foliage. They reassured themselves it was nothing to worry about. Perhaps a fellow guest staying nearby, out for an evening walk. After all, this was a popular vacation area. Still, they locked the door and closed the curtains before returning to the living room. Later that evening, they were halfway through a movie when the doorbell rang. The sound was startling, shattering the quiet of the cabin. They hadn't seen anyone pull into the driveway, and it was well past sunset. Heart pounding, they cautiously approached the door. Through the peephole, they saw him, the same man from the woods. He looked unkempt, his hair messy, his clothes wrinkled and dirty. When they opened the door slightly, he spoke in a low, apologetic voice. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, avoiding eye contact. "I got turned around in the woods and I'm lost. Can I use your phone to call someone?" The protagonist's instincts told them something was wrong. His presence felt off, like he was too calm for someone genuinely lost in the woods. They offered to grab their phone but insisted on keeping the door closed. When they returned moments later, phone in hand, he was gone. Confused and uneasy, they stepped out onto the porch and called out into the darkness, but there was no response. The driveway was empty, the woods silent. It was as if he had vanished. They retreated inside, double-checking every lock and closing every curtain, trying to convince themselves it was just a harmless misunderstanding. The next morning, the sun brought some relief. The events of the night before felt almost dreamlike, distant. They told themselves it was nothing to worry about as they sipped their coffee on the deck, letting the fresh air calm their nerves. But then they saw him again. This time, he was further away, standing among the trees. He wasn't walking, wasn't moving, just standing there, watching the cabin. The protagonist's stomach churned. They tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was another guest who happened to be in the same area. Maybe he was harmless. But the way he stood there, unflinching, made them feel sick with unease. That night, just as they were trying to convince themselves to sleep, the doorbell rang again. Their blood ran cold. Hesitating for a moment, they peered through the peephole. There he was, the same man, his expression blank but his eyes intense. He repeated the exact same words as the night before. "I'm sorry to bother you. I got turned around in the woods and I'm lost. Can I use your phone to call someone?" His tone, his phrasing, it was all the same, as if rehearsed. This time, they didn't even respond. Panic surged through their veins as they slammed the door shut and locked it, their hands trembling. They knew they couldn't stay there another night. Grabbing their belongings, they packed in a frenzy, tossing everything into their car. Their only thought was to get out. As they backed out of the driveway, headlights illuminating the cabin, they glanced up, and their hearts stopped. The man was inside the cabin, standing at the window, staring out at them. They never reported the incident. They didn't even contact the Airbnb host. All they wanted was to forget the weekend and never set foot in a remote cabin again. But no matter how much time has passed, the memory of his face at the window still haunts them. Who was he? How did he get inside? And most chilling of all, what would have happened if they had stayed? For anyone who loves the outdoors, the Appalachian Mountains are a dream destination. Endless trails, breathtaking views, and the kind of tranquility you can only find deep in nature. For one experienced solo backpacker, it was the perfect escape. They had planned a 3-day trip, hoping to disconnect from the demands of daily life and immerse themselves in the peace of the wilderness. The trip began without a hitch. They set out early in the morning, following a well-marked trail that wound through dense forests and along ridges with panoramic views. The silence was refreshing, broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional birdsong. By late afternoon, they found a secluded clearing near a stream to set up camp. It was picturesque, the kind of spot you'd expect to see on a postcard. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they lit a small fire and prepared a simple dinner. The warmth of the fire was comforting against the cool mountain air. Sitting there, they marveled at how quiet it was. No cars, no voices, just the hum of nature. But as the hours wore on and darkness settled in, that silence began to feel heavier, almost oppressive. They finished eating and tidied up before retreating to their tent. Crawling into their sleeping bag, they zipped the tent shut and lay back, ready for a good night's sleep. But just as they were beginning to drift off, they heard it, a loud, sharp snap. It wasn't a rustle or the creak of a tree. It was the distinct sound of a stick breaking, and it was close. Their eyes shot open, heart pounding as they listened intently. The sound was followed by silence, an eerie stillness that made their skin crawl. They tried to rationalize it. Maybe a deer had wandered too close, or a raccoon was searching for scraps. It was the forest, after all. But the sound had been too deliberate, too loud to dismiss so easily. Unable to shake the unease, they grabbed their flashlight and cautiously unzipped the tent. The cold night air rushed in as they stepped out, scanning the surrounding trees with the beam of light. The fire had died down, and shadows danced at the edges of the clearing. Nothing moved. No eyes reflected back in the darkness. After a few minutes of searching, they retreated to the tent, though sleep didn't come easily. Hours later, they were startled awake by something far more alarming, the sound of footsteps. Not a single crunch or shuffle, but the unmistakable sound of someone running. The footsteps were fast, frantic, and they were close. Frozen in place, they held their breath, ears straining to pinpoint the sound. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the running stopped. They sat up, adrenaline surging, and unzipped the tent once more. Flashlight in hand, they stepped into the clearing, their heart hammering in their chest. The forest was still, the night eerily quiet. The only sound was the rush of their own breathing. They circled the campsite, shining the light in every direction, but saw no one. As dawn broke, the events of the night weighed heavily on them. They packed their belongings quickly, eager to leave, but it was only as they dismantled the tent that they noticed something chilling. Footprints. Human footprints. The prints weren't random or scattered. They formed a deliberate path, circling the tent. Some were faint, likely made the night before, while others were fresh, pressed into the damp earth. Whoever had been out there hadn't just stumbled upon the campsite. They had been watching, moving quietly around the tent as they slept. A sinking feeling settled in their stomach. This wasn't an animal or a coincidence. Someone had been there, and they had been far too close for comfort. The hike back to the car felt endless. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves set their nerves on edge. They glanced over their shoulder constantly, half expecting to see someone following. When they finally reached their car, they locked the doors and sped off, desperate to put as much distance as possible between them and the forest. Even now, the memory of that night haunts them. The thought of someone lurking outside their tent, just a thin layer of fabric away, fills them with dread. And the question that lingers most, if they hadn't woken up, what would have happened? Finding an affordable place to live can feel like winning the lottery, especially when you're on a tight budget. So, when the protagonist stumbled across an ad for a room in a house on the outskirts of town, they thought their search was over. The rent was reasonable, the photos looked great, and the landlord seemed friendly during their first meeting. The house was quiet, clean, and surrounded by thick woods, giving it an air of privacy. It seemed perfect, or so they thought. Moving in was uneventful. The landlord, a man in his 50s, helped carry a few boxes and gave a brief tour of the property. He seemed polite, if a little awkward, but nothing about him set off immediate alarm bells. For the first week, everything was fine. The landlord kept to himself, and the protagonist began settling into their new home. But soon, small things started to feel off. The landlord seemed to have an uncanny way of appearing whenever the protagonist left their room, as though he was waiting for them. At first, it was easy to brush off as coincidence. He was just a little strange, they thought, quirky, maybe. But then came the odd encounters late at night. On several occasions, the protagonist would get up for a glass of water and find the landlord standing in the kitchen, staring blankly out the window, as if lost in thought. He never said much during these moments, only offering a vague "couldn't sleep" before retreating to his room. Then there was the door. One evening, while tidying up their room, the protagonist noticed something strange about the lock on their bedroom door. It didn't work the way most locks did. It locked from the outside, not the inside. A cold wave of unease washed over them as they stared at it, testing it several times to make sure they weren't imagining things. Why would a bedroom door lock that way? They told themselves it was just an old house with peculiar hardware, but the discovery stuck with them. The landlord's behavior only got stranger. He began knocking on the protagonist's door at odd hours, often with flimsy excuses. "I need to check the radiator," he'd say at midnight. Or, "I think the window might be leaking. Can I take a look?" Each time, the protagonist refused, making up reasons to avoid letting him in. Still, the landlord didn't seem deterred, and his persistence became unsettling. One night, during a rare conversation in the kitchen, the landlord mentioned a previous tenant. "They didn't stay long," he said with a chuckle, though he didn't elaborate on why. His laugh was hollow, and the way he looked at the protagonist sent a shiver down their spine. It was then that they decided they needed to leave. The next day, they began searching for a new place, and by the end of the week, they had arranged to move out. The plan was to leave quietly, pack everything into a U-Haul, and disappear without confrontation. But the landlord seemed to sense something was up. The day before the move, he started lingering near the protagonist, pacing in the hallway and muttering to himself. That night, they locked the door and shoved a chair under the handle, just in case. Moving day arrived, and everything seemed to be going smoothly at first. They loaded boxes into the truck as quickly as possible, hoping to finish before the landlord noticed. But as they carried out the final load, he appeared in the driveway. His demeanor had changed completely. Gone was the polite, awkward man they had met weeks earlier. He was angry, accusing them of breaking the lease and threatening to call the police. The protagonist tried to remain calm, explaining that they had every right to leave. But the landlord wouldn't back down. His voice grew louder, his tone more hostile, and then, out of nowhere, he pulled out a key and began moving toward the back of the U-Haul. Before they could react, he slammed the doors shut, locking them inside. Panic set in as the protagonist banged on the doors, shouting for help. They could hear the landlord outside, muttering to himself, his voice growing more agitated. After what felt like an eternity, the doors suddenly swung open. But instead of confronting them, the landlord bolted into the woods, disappearing among the trees. Shaken and terrified, the protagonist called the police. When they arrived, they searched the area but couldn't find the landlord. However, his car was still parked outside, engine running, as though he had been planning to leave. The story didn't end there. A few days later, the police called with an update. During their investigation of the house, they had found something chilling in the landlord's room, a large duffel bag, locked tight. Inside were knives, duct tape, and other tools that suggested sinister intentions. Though they couldn't prove what he had planned, the implications were clear. The landlord's whereabouts remained unknown. To this day, the protagonist can't shake the memory of that horrifying encounter. What would have happened if they hadn't moved out? And what exactly had the landlord been planning with the contents of that duffel bag? The answers may never be known, but one thing is certain: they will never rent a room from a stranger again.